Aaron Dykes here for True Stream Media, and I just wanted to get as much of this as I could on the record. It's a chapter about Frankenfoods, the alchemical vegetable Frankenstein, the seedless seeds of the androgenes food. Now, that's a mouthful to be sure. It comes out of this book, Transhumanism, a Grimoire of Alchemical Agendas by Joseph P. Farrell, Dr. Scott D. Hart, and a lot of it's based on Seeds of Destruction by William F. Engdahl, a great author. And basically, we'll leave most of the occultic aspects of alchemy for another time, but you could just think of it as a transformation, in this case of society or humanity. And they get into the Rockefellers and their connection to older systems, including Francis Bacon, but on the basic idea that the modern elites, the contemporary elites, are following the idea of, number one, an upper limit or carrying capacity for the number of people who can populate this planet, and they presume that there are too many useless eaters.
The population explosion demands that old methods and places give way to new.
And this leads them to other conclusions, including number two, that this calls for social engineering measures, including various methods of population reduction and genetic manipulation of the food supply. Number three, this in turn can be affected by the engineering of man himself, by the injection of human genes into plants, or the injection into plant genes into humans.
Just because the corn is sentient and in constant pain doesn't mean it's unhealthy or unsafe to eat.
Again, to transform humanity and society towards a transhumanism where the actual human being is changed, the DNA is changed, it becomes a different person. And then they talk about how it is known, it's on the record, that the Rockefeller Foundation and others financed the American Eugenics Society and the records office at Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory in New York, which was the home base of the former uppercase eugenics in America. And when they did that, they cataloged millions of index cards on the bloodlines of ordinary Americans, and they tried to map inferior bloodlines and basically mark them for extinction. And that's not exactly an exaggeration. They did a lot of other things under eugenics, but this chapter gets into how one of the Rockefeller experts was Frederick Osborne, a founding member of the American Eugenics Society, an admirer of the Nazis, one who instructed the Nazis, and he was the first president of John D. Rockefeller III's Population Council. Osborne quoted in 1956, after World War II, how the Nazi movement had all but killed the eugenics movement because they adopted the U.S. and British system of eugenics, and then they got themselves a bad name. He said, in part, eugenics was to be mass-marketed under a new guise. Instead of talking about eliminating inferior people through forced sterilizations or birth control, there would be free choice of family, size, and quality. So you should notice some propaganda terms there. A lot of people don't realize where they get their idea on how many children they want and what they think about society and people's rights. A lot of it has been directly steered through Rockefeller-sponsored propaganda. All of this, the authors write, was to be accomplished by a mass market campaign of social engineering, appealing to the new idea of, quote, wanted children.
Women in their early 30s with 3 to 5 children want to stop having more children. We know that married women 20 to 39 want fewer children, approve of family planning, and are trying ineffectively to limit the size of their families.
They touch further upon the connections between Osborne, that is the first president of John D. Rockefeller's Population Council, and some of the Nazi eugenicists. Here they cite Herman J. Mueller, who talked about, quote, it would be in the end far easier and more sensible to manufacture a completely new man, de novo, out of appropriately chosen raw materials than to try to refashion into human form those pitiful relics which remain. And in that statement, they're alluding to that the base of humanity is flawed and that they're not needed and that extinction would be just great. It gets right into the transhumanist idea, and they talk about sperm banks and high-quality donors, and they're talking about genetically breeding an entire new class of humans. Then they get into the Rockefeller Foundation and their sponsorship of many, many things, but among them, the War and Peace Studies Group of the New York Council on Foreign Relations for $350,000, and this was before World War II, an enormous sum at the time. And look at this study, isn't it telling? It was to study the post-war role of the U.S., assuming that there would be a world war and that the U.S. would emerge from the ashes as the dominant global power. The study of the group further projected that the U.S. would replace the British Empire as the preeminent global power and planned accordingly. They say that rather than the British model of physically possessing colonies all around the world as they did, the CFR study group would base it around the idea of controlling the economic influence.
Family planning is an integral part of development planning. You cannot hope to plan other forms of production if you cannot plan the production of the main resource, the human beings.
Look at what happens today with the IMF, the World Bank, the central banks, and other related organizations. They have those countries under their grip while they're formally in name free. Within this context, John D. Rockefeller III was, of course, pursuing eugenics and depopulation policies via the Population Council. They tie a lot of population control measures to countries tied directly to loans and other funding. At the same time, his brother Nelson Rockefeller was working on the worldwide food production problem, and this led to what was known as the Green Revolution.
Man is planting in narrow rows to increase his food production to meet the growing demand for food. Modern technology is bringing life-giving food in ever-increasing quantities.
And they wanted to dominate agriculture technology and thereby global food production. Why? Well, it feeds into the alchemy. Of course, it's profitable, it leads to control, and it's also a depopulation weapon. To this end, Rockefeller interests promised a green revolution and focused in sensitive areas of India, one of the most populous nations anywhere, and other places in Asia, also Mexico and other places in Latin America. And they had enormous reach in those places. Not only did they seek to increase food production, but moving it towards a homogenized, mass-scale agribusiness drove peasants from the land as they were no longer needed, and instead they were driven into the slums of cities, which would become increasingly populous, and they would become cheap labor for huge multinational corporations. All these different plans feed off of each other, and they're incredible in their reach. John D. Rockefeller III also was involved in the Agriculture Development Council, which basically got universities in the U.S. to select Asian and other foreigners, train them as scientists, and then send them back to carry out the agribusiness proposals.
We have the research, the industrial know-how, the technology, the capability, and we must sow these things like seeds for all mankind.
And if you look through the Rockefeller Foundation documents, as Melissa and I have, you'll find a lot of people brought to universities, for instance, Texas A&M, which focuses on agriculture, and they trained them. They paid for these scientists to come over, and then they carry out genetically modified crop planting and the like. The overall Rockefeller goal? Well, they say in part, quote, science would eventually come to control the fundamental processes of biology. They literally want to control the entire cycle of life, from birth to death, everything in between. They want to control hormones, they want to control glands, they want to control genes. They have no limit to what they attempt to accomplish, and all their funding towards genetic research and more has been part of this goal. It was part of their ultimate means of social control and social engineering, eugenics.
The same way that you provide a farmer with greater knowledge about the seed, about fertility of the soil, about climate, about rotation of crops, it's the same way that you must provide that information, that education, to the person.
To this end, the Rockefeller Foundation invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1980s, both indirectly and directly, to sponsor genetic research into food crops, which basically put the entire world at the hands of a neo-feudalism system. Instead of the feudal serf system where you reported to a lord, now you report to a big agribusiness company, maybe Cargill, maybe Archer Daniels Midland, maybe ConAgra.
A giant continent, a giant plantation.
We get into specifically how the U.S. took over Iraq after it invaded in 2003, and it took over what was 10,000 years plus of wheat and crop research. They wiped it all out, took out their big seed bank, and replaced it with genetically modified, patented Terminator seeds, and basically forced them to grow it. They did a similar thing into Argentina. That's a long case that they get into a lot of details over. But the bottom line is they say that the Americans caught Argentina in a debt trap not unlike that which the British had used to take control of the Suez Canal from Egypt. New York bankers, led by David Rockefeller, had learned the lessons of British debt imperialism. Not only had they learned the lessons, but they learned them well, and they used them.
But never could these ancient methods support life in our great cities today. Modern machinery is the only answer. These men rely on the newest equipment to get their grain and straw from field to market.
And so we find that this totals more than just the sum of its parts, as many things do, thus the idea of the alchemy, a larger transformation through the chemistry between these things interacting. There's a transhumanist agenda that supersedes just being biotechnology and genetically modified plants. It supersedes just being population control or just eugenics. It turns over total control, and these things interplay between one another. The agribusiness multinationals have used World Trade Organization agreements and other global agreements to get their intellectual property rights accepted on a worldwide basis. They specifically talk about the TRIPS, or trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement, and how it opened the door, specifically enforced intellectual property rights among member countries for inventions connected to plants, specifically there in Article 27.3b. And this is just one agreement as an example because it spans many. But the TRIPS agreement was also designed by multinationals to seize the generic resources of the planet, chiefly in the third world countries who have the greatest biodiversity. And again, they talk about India, they've talked about places in Asia, they've talked about Argentina, Mexico, and other places in Latin America, all of which have been heavily infiltrated by genetically modified foods and the population control agenda. How do they work together? Well, William F. Engdahl has done enough research to know that it's all part of a master plan, and Rockefeller is involved in quite a bit of it. He highlights the very thing that came to my mind, which is the 1974 Henry Kissinger National Security Memorandum 200, which used food as a weapon to control populations in the developing world.
A different kind of power is the power of hunger. Enough food for today will never again guarantee enough for tomorrow. There can be no turning back the human tide, those 6 billion people predicted by the year 2000.
If developing nations don't restrict their populations, or if they don't implement family planning programs, they can be denied food aid. But this happened at the same time, well, not only that Nelson Rockefeller was vice president, but at the same time they were beginning to introduce gene technologies and beginning to develop a technology to allow private multinationals to own the patents on seed varieties. So the companies can deny seeds to those who won't pay for it. They can introduce foods or genetically modified foods if they refuse to restrict their population. And that gets into the byproducts and side effects of genetically modified seeds.
And so in North America and many lands around the earth, people and machines become soldiers in the battle for the future.
But this is part of a bigger killing us softly. And of course, they've even created genetically modified foods with sperm antibodies, infertility agents grown into the plants. Would you ever know if you were eating them? Only if they told you. This stuff is so far-reaching. It's part of a larger transhumanist agenda. It's a takeover of the natural life. Why? Because those in charge of it want to be able to control life. They want to be able to make a patent price off of it, and they want to be able to unauthorize people to reproduce or to eat, or both, as they see fit. Signing off for TrueStreamMedia.com.